If dragons are essential for fantasy, then this might just be the most fantastic book ever. And that might actually be true. Cheers! Welcome back, everybody, to me actually talking about books, and one specific book, and that book is I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons by Peter S. Beagle, which came out yesterday, and I read it, and it's fantastic, and you should absolutely go and read it. And I'm going to tell you why in the next couple of minutes. And we'll do this the usual way, or like the way I did this before everything went to shit, and that means I'll give you a quick synopsis with no spoilers whatsoever, and then I'll talk about certain aspects of the book where I think that's why it shines, and that's why it makes so much sense to read it, and that's why it works. You know, a quick advertisement basically, and then we'll do some deep analysis or something that passes for it on booktube. All right, so I guess let's get started, shall we? What is I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons? Well, it's a story of a dragon slayer who doesn't want to be a dragon slayer, of a princess who doesn't want to be a princess, and a prince who doesn't really want to be a prince, and they have to save the world. That's kind of the really, really short part. It's a sort of whimsical fantasy, very traditional fantasy with some fairy tale elements in it, of course. Peter S. Beagle being the author of course, The Last Unicorn, so you kind of know where this is going. It's a very traditional European style medieval fantasy world. There's a lot of dragons, and our main hero, Robert, is a dragon hunter, which is slightly different in this world than in some other worlds, but that's kind of the thing. And then he meets a princess and he meets a prince, and they have to figure out how to save the world together. It's a fun story. I'm not gonna tell you how it ends. You should go and read it immediately. That's kind of the point here. It's really good. Peter S. Beagle hasn't published a book in years and years and years and years. What are you waiting for? It's also rather short. It's relatively lighthearted. It's, the kind of thing you might call a palate cleanser by an absolute master of the genre in like all the ways. It's, probably the best book published in 2024 that I've read so far. And that's kind of the thing. Go fucking read it right now, and then come back and we talk about why it is so fucking good. All right. I assume you've read it or you don't care about spoilers. Either one is perfect. Now, here's why I think this book works. And well, it all boils down to something that I'll come back to at the end, and that is a lot of genre fiction, like a lot of fiction in general, but especially genre fiction, is about taking the different parts of that genre and rearranging them in new and interesting ways. Playing with the genre and playing with the form is what makes fantasy good. And this book does so in a masterful way. So let's get started here and start with pseudo-medieval Europe as a setting. Now, a lot of fantasy books do that. It's something that we've talked about, why a lot of like epic fantasy feels so very, very white and Western. Although this is slowly changing, but a lot of this stuff. But there's ways of doing this, and there's ways of doing it poorly. And I want to argue that the way Peter S. Beagle approaches this is probably one of the best ways of doing this, because it doesn't even pretend to be realistic. It doesn't even pretend to be, authentic to a medieval European experience in, say, the way that some grimdark fantasy tries to do so. It goes all into the different, the fabulous, the fable style of telling about a story, which is something that we see in other books. We'll come back to one of the big parallels that I felt reminded of all the time when reading this book is Farmer Giles of Ham by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is very much a bit of a parody of medieval legends and medieval writings. And yeah, I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons does have a similar approach in the way that it kind of mixes real European countries, real European people, and so forth with fantastic stuff in the way it does put in some pseudo Latin in a lot of ways. Our main character, Robert, is famously named after four different Roman emperors, including Trans-Icon Heliogabalus, which is really cool. So we have that as one part. It's the way it doesn't even pretend to be that authentic or realistic. Instead, it goes like, this is a dream world. This is how we imagine or how we wish Middle Ages, medieval Europe would be. It's got dragons, it's got castles everywhere, it's got noble knights. It's far closer to, a medieval romance style of depicting the world. If you read your Arthurian myths, Arthurian legends from the Middle Ages, especially the French ones, it kind of goes back into that direction and then slightly pokes fun at it. And that is the second part, whimsy. Now, whimsy is a bit of a difficult thing to pull off because it's one of those terms that are slightly difficult to define. I'm going to try now, and then we'll see why this works so well with Peter S. Beagle. Whimsy in this case is sort of a form of humor, but it's not fully humor. It's kind of funny in some ways. Um, but it's the low stakes kind of humor, the kind of quirkiness and so forth. That's something that we see a lot with Peter Spiegel. He's always done so in every book that he's written. There's always been elements of whimsy, whether it's in his first novel, A Fine and Private Place, whether it's in The Last Unicorn. It's always been there. It's part of his style. And here he pulls it off in a lot of ways. Let's start with something here, right? Dragons. There's a lot of dragons in this book. And a lot of these dragons are very small dragons. They're more like pets. They go like in all different sizes, like pets basically. And having pet dragons is obviously something that we find with Terry Pratchett, but Beagle goes into all kinds of other directions there as well. But the idea of having a small dragon that you can have like sit on your shoulder, that you can stroke, that can run around, behave like a cat basically, or a dog, depending on its size, that's whimsical. It's also funny, and it gives, um, the author reasons or like opportunities to be humorous and be funny in a lighthearted way, like the opening scene when Robert is waking up and the dragons are crawling over his bed and trying to, take apart his bed and, well, pull over the coverlet and everything. And yeah, that feels like if you've ever had a cat and woken up, you know that part. And then he kind of twists it a bit, and then you learn that, yeah, because these dragons are kind of smart, they actually make the bed after Robert has gone down. And that's really cool, and that's really funny, and it's imaginative, but it's also very whimsical. And as I said, Peter S. Beagle has always been a master of the whimsical. And this level of whimsy does actually go really well with a pseudo-medieval or romantic image of pseudo-medieval Europe. If you ever looked at, the illustrations of medieval manuscripts, there's a lot of like really weird whimsical imagery there in the sides. It kind of ties back to different like fables about animals, talking animals, and so forth. It all goes back into that very specific feeling of a fairy tale, of a fable, of a medieval romantic story that this book is deliberately evoking. But that's only half of it, I think. There's a second part here, and I think once again we have to go back to Tolkien in this regard, and also like another author that has heavily been influenced by Peter S. Beagle, that being, of course, Neil Gaiman. And that second part, the opposite side of whimsy, I think, is a certain level of melancholy, certain level of nostalgia. See, these are obviously romantic stories in a traditional sense. It's not a romance, but it's a romantic story. And one key part of the romantic movement is always been the yearning for a better past. And while the world in this book, in I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons, is not perfect or anything, a lot of things seem relatively harmless. And there's always this like slight yearning for that better past. Yeah, it's what I call melancholy or nostalgia. A lot of characters do have, dreams, have a certain melancholy for, you know, well, things could be better, I guess. And I think that's one of the things that makes sort of that pairs well with whimsy. You have like these small bits and pieces, but you also have, yeah, that idea that it would be really cool to live in that kind of world, in that imagined Middle Ages that were so much cooler, so much better, so much more romantic than the very cruel world that we live in today. It's something that, say, Tolkien, once again, harkens back to a lot in his very specific form of conservatism, in this very specific way of talking about the world, his enmity towards or his hatred towards technology and technological progress. All of these things go in that very specific form of romance or like romanticism, I guess. And as I said, it pairs well with whimsy. Once again, Farmer Giles of Ham is very much the model for this, I think, where we also hear about a simpler time, a better time when things were easier. And it once again, it pairs well with the whimsy, it pairs well with this very specific medieval romantic type of medieval Europe that is played here, and I think that gives us a setting that we can then build a story upon, which is exactly what Peter S. Beagle does with this. Which brings us to sort of the thing that fables, that legends can do, which is mirror our own world and tell us something about our own world. So let's get slightly political and talk about class, among other things, and talk about gender and stuff like that. All right, let's start with class here and then move over to gender because there's something really interesting here. We have a bunch of characters, some of these being, your average working people, farm people, the valet to the prince. All of these characters are what you might call working class people. And then you have the nobility. And here's something really interesting that kind of mirrors something that we know about our own world, but have also, seen before. And that is the nobility is useless. The nobility doesn't know anything. When Robert tries to learn how to be a valet, the thing he gets taught is that you need to kind of treat nobility, kings, dukes, and so forth, princes. You need to treat those like children. You need to tell them what to do. You need to tell them how to dress. You need to do all of these things because they don't know how to do this thing. They are very insecure. They're listening to people behind them that actually tell them how to do stuff. And this is obviously something that has been done before. Don't get me wrong. And we're getting to the twist in a bit. I think this is something that has done before. That is something we know about, very rich people, very powerful, supposedly powerful people. Nobility today is like, these people only function because they have a lot of people behind them that actually keep the system running. They're mostly figureheads in a lot of ways. So far, that is not exactly new. Now, the interesting thing here is that, Beagle uses this, for example, when it comes to reading and writing, literacy, something that the nobility doesn't have. In his world, kings and queens and princesses and princes don't know how to read or write because they've never been taught. It's something that only the lower classes do, which is a nice twist. And now we go and look at something else, and this being obviously gender roles. See, in this world, it's mostly women that know how to read and write, that go to school and get education, whereas men have to go out into the fields and work really early on. Robert being a bit of an exception because his mother taught him how to read and write, whereas his sisters go to school. So once again, we have something really interesting here, which is we have very rigid gender roles in a lot of ways in this book. But they're slightly twisted. And they acknowledge the fact that in a lot of cases, women um, do a lot of the hard work, or not necessarily the hard work, but like a lot of work that is more intellectually challenging, that requires education and so forth. Whereas men are oftentimes doing stuff that is more heroic because it takes place outside. There's an interesting thought to be had in writings by, say, David Graeber, that the kind of stories, the kind of jobs, the kind of gender roles that men take over for themselves are the kind of jobs, the kind of tasks that lend themselves to be turned into stories. And I think it's something that we can see with Beagle trying to take on here, which is exactly that. It's like men go out and have the adventures, then it's actually women who tell these stories, but and write these stories because men are actually not even able to do that. So once again, he kind of twists that thing around, the idea of having rigid gender roles, but sort of showing up something here that in the way that women get education, whereas men are used as well, the workhorses basically of society, which kind of flips the way around that a lot of like labor is separated in our world, where it's usually women doing all the hard work and men kind of getting the other stuff to do, or at least used to be. So he twists that around. I think that's one thing that a story like this allows him to tell, is basically flipping these things around, turning around the idea of importance between the nobility and the working classes. On the other hand, flipping around the importance or the privileges of gender roles. And he can do that because it's a fantasy story. It's a fanciful tale. And I think, yeah, it just works really well in the way he does that. Now, that's one part here. Now we come to the second part where I think we need to talk about, and that is parent and child relations, and on the other hand, expectations and fulfilling role expectations. So what do I mean with that? all our three main characters labor under their difficult relationships, or not even necessarily difficult relationships with their parents. That being Robert really not wanting to be a dragon hunter or dragon exterminator like his father, and constantly trying to be different than his father. It's a very complicated relationship there. The same goes for the princess, who does not necessarily want to do the things that her mother wants her to do. She tries to fulfill that role. She fails at that role ultimately, of trying to attract a handsome prince. Instead, she ends up with Robert. But so there's that part. The same goes for our main prince, who is constantly struggling under the oppression of, or like the expectations of his father, who wants him to be martial and, well, the most toxically masculine man you can possibly imagine. He doesn't want to do that. So we have the idea that there is obviously the expectations of parents whom you love usually, and you don't want to disappoint them. But on the other hand, at some point you need to figure out who you really want to be. And the question is like, how do you get out of that shadow? And Beagle pairs that with obviously the role expectations of different people. Princesses are not supposed to learn how to read, but she wants to read, so she starts reading. On the other hand, princes are supposed to kill dragons, even if they don't want to kill dragons and don't want to fight. Just go somewhere and look at the sun and learn stuff and drink beer. Um, and dragon hunters are not supposed to be anything but dragon hunters. So we have like role expectations that are more tied to roles in society, and we have the expectations of parents and how those oftentimes intersect, because, and this is made very clear in this book as well. It's like parents have fulfilled those like societal roles and sometimes project, you know, the suffering or the of adjusting to these roles onto their children. It's like, yeah, I hated it, but I kind of got used to it, so you'd better do the same thing. And that's obviously something that we've learned before in all kinds of situations when we talk with older generations, where they're like, well, we had it shit hard, so you better have it hard as well. That's not how it should work. And ultimately, this book justifies that or vindicates that, in that none of our main characters, actually main heroes or heroines, actually end up doing that, but instead choose the thing they want to choose to become happy. And I think that's one of the marvelous things here. So these are like the larger contexts here. Now let's look at some of the other things that I think are important, why this book works so successfully. So on the first level, we have a very specific setting that works really well with the expectations of the fantasy genre. It's pseudo-medieval, but it kind of puts a twist on it by turning it into a more whimsical, also more melancholy, romantic version of the Middle Ages in Europe, and making that very much like the key part here, and make it very clear this is not supposed to be realistic. But it then kind of builds a counterpoint to that by using this setting to tell stories or make points about very real issues in our world, about gender, about class, about expectations, about parent-child relations, about the way these things tend or could possibly cause harm, and about these parts. So that's those two layers. Now let's look at like why it actually works so really well in the way all these things get resolved. I think one part here, and this is an important part, is Peter S. Beagle's very specific style of writing stories. And I would call that a very oral storytelling style of writing. His prose is very much down that specific road. You can listen. I listen to the audiobook, and trust me, it's the kind of story, it's written in the kind of language that feels like someone is telling you this story at the fireside or whatever, which allows for, clever asides to the reader in a lot of ways. This once again brings us back to Tolkien as one of the main sort of like books or texts I would compare it to, especially with Tolkien's writing in both The Hobbit and, well, Farmer Giles of Ham, but also parts of Lord of the Rings, where we have asides, but mainly in The Hobbit, where we have asides to the audience, like this is what happened, and so forth, where the fourth wall sort of is broken and the narrator addresses the audience directly. This is something that Beagle does from time to time, and he does it here. And I think it lends itself to this very specific story because it emphasizes the idea of this being, well, a romantic tale, a fairy tale, which are obviously traditions that have been um, traditionally told orally by storytellers with like slight variations, with jokes that are appropriate to a specific audience, and it feels like that in a lot of ways. So that's one part that makes this book work really well. The next part, I think, is, and this is where we kind of bring it back to, the fairy tale tradition again, is it has a happy end. It very much has a happy end. It has the kind of happy end that fairy tales should have, but it's adapted to our more like modern sensibilities in that, yes, each of these characters fulfills their individual goals. If you compare this to a fairy tale, usually, the endings are very conservative. And don't get me wrong, this is not, ultra progressive here, but at the end of the day, each of the three main characters gets the thing they want to have. Robert gets to be, with the princess, also gets to be no longer a dragon hunter killing dragons, which, he doesn't want to do because he likes dragons. The prince gets to go off and lie on a field and stare into the sun, and, get drunk, get very, very drunk is apparently the thing that he wants to do. And like have a relaxing time, no longer living up to any ideas. Even his valet, who has been, running the kingdom all the time, gets to be king, well, or technically his replacement, while the prince is on his way adventuring, so to speak, which also makes him happy. Everyone gets what they really want, not necessarily what society wants for them, but what they really want. And this I think is an important part here. This is what kind of pushes it towards almost the cozy genre in a lot of ways, because a lot of us in these days in this world struggle with the fact that we don't live up to the expectations that society at large has for us. We feel different in a lot of ways. Maybe we're marginalized in one form or another. Maybe we're queer. Maybe we have a disability. Whatever. A lot of us struggle with that. And the dream, a happy end, is to get what we want or what we truly want, and not what others think we want. And this story does that, and I think that works really well. Also, with having the twist of the like kind of oddballs. I think that's something that made, for example, another media property, in this case a movie, that feels very similar, or not, not very similar, but like has definitely similar themes, would be Shrek, where you also have like the oddballs ending up with the people that make them truly happy in a lot of ways, in a more like whimsical fantasy land. So that's another part. We have a happy ending here. And this, I think, brings us to the final part. That final part, of course, being, well, first of all, the villain being an evil wizard who had a fight with the prince's dad, with the well, very toxically masculine king. And all this is not even the current generation of heroes' faults. And that part, I think, is another interesting thing, which you can build like larger themes about. It's like a lot of times we as current generation are fighting the demons of our parents' generation, or dealing with the problems our parents' generation has unleashed, whether it's, well, climate change, for example, or other environmental disasters. A lot of stuff is, us dealing with what our parents have left us. And Peter Beagle kind of puts this in here. This should have been like earlier, but I don't script, so this is, why I had to bring this in. But let's bring this all together. We have a happy ending. We have a very happy ending that kind of plays upon the idea that, upon the way that happy endings usually are in fairy tales, by making it more individual, making it less about very specific societal and expectations. We have a very specific prose style that harkens closer to like oral storytelling. And we have all these other aspects before that. All of this is what I would call playful, which brings us back to the whole thing. Genre is very much about having specific tropes, having specific formalistic expectations towards the genre. If I read fantasy, this stuff that I want. As I said in the intro, dragons, right? If there's dragons, it's fantasy. The same way that if there's a spaceship, it's science fiction, right? We have these very specific expectations. What makes a book good, or even excellent, is if the author is able to take these expectations and play with them, sort of push the boundaries from time to time, push them back, make slight twists, but always within these expectations, showing us as readers that the author has understood the breadth, the depth of said genre, and can put in their personal experiences and so forth in that. Infuse that with, human emotions, with things that we as humans feel, the way we want to, feel, the way we want to interact with other people, both the good and the bad, and you're really far along the road. And this is exactly why I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons is such a good book, because it does all of that. Peter S. Beagle is a master of the genre. We've always known that, like back in the day, even something like The Last Unicorn only works so incredibly well because it takes the genre conventions of a fantasy, of a fairy tale, and kind of puts them into new dimensions. It kind of twists them slightly, gives us a new perspective on the whole thing. And I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons does exactly the same thing with dragons, with lots of dragons, with cute little dragons, with dangerous big dragons. And it's at the end of the day, it's about being who you are, not giving in, being indomitable like the king, the dragon king, that being, and finding the thing you want to do, the thing you are best at, and well, having maybe some fun along the way. Add some jokes, and there's some really funny jokes in this book. And yeah, that's that. And I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons has all of that. It's very, very close to perfection when it comes to writing a whimsical, yet dark, yet, mature fantasy book with a happy ending that everyone could and should read. And that's why I think it works so really well. It's like showing genre mastery by being playful about it and having something meaningful to say underneath it all. Anyway, these are my thoughts on I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons. Have you read it yet? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Tell me other stuff in the comments if you feel like it. I don't like, subscribe, do the things. If you want to give me money, there's a Patreon and there's a PayPal or whatever. But mainly, talk to me about what you thought about this book because I'm really excited about it. I love it. So yeah, thanks for this, and I'll see you very soon. And until then, cheers.